Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Tonight's speaker is most certainly no stranger. Mrs. Salam Kaoukji, known affectionately here as Sue, has been involved with the al-Sabah collection for decades. A warm friend of the Dar, many, if not most of you, will recognize her because of her constant presence in our weekly lecture series. However, she is most active behind the scenes. Currently, senior curator and collection manager of the al-Sabah collection. She has long been involved before she became professionally associated with al-Athar al-Islamiyyah and the al-Sabah collection. Whether producing a museum guide for children or assisting the then curator, Ms. Emmanuel Keane, her passionate devotion to the collection got her involved in editing many of the collection's scholarly publications. In her journey from volunteer to assistant to the curator, to assistant curator, to now senior curator, Mrs. Kaoukji has acquired a formidable experience not only on the al-Sabah collection, but also on Islamic art as well. Currently, she is an author in her own right, writing monographs and co-authoring exhibition catalogs. Mrs. Kaoukji presented a discussion here several years ago entitled "The Shard Lineage of a European and an Indian Dagger." This evening, she will be dealing with Indian weapons as well in a lecture entitled "Precious Indian Weapons and the al-Sabah Collection." This is the title of the book she wrote, and she will be signing this book at the end of her lecture. There is, however, another weapon that is always used to detract from our lectures. And while it may be precious to some of you, it hardly is a work of art. This is a hint for you to turn off your mobile phones, and let's welcome Mrs. Salam Kaoukji.
I would like to thank Sheikh Hassan for asking me to give a talk about those magnificent Indian weapons that are in the al-Sabah collection. And weapons which are a testament to the legendary opulence and refinement of Indian courts, and especially the uninterrupted Indian tradition of exceptional craftsmanship. In the course of my work at the collection, I became aware that weapons were generally considered the prerogative of arms and armor specialists, and were rarely rated as works of art, despite being indistinguishable from other jeweled arts in style and technique. These details go to show the type and variety of jewelry making techniques used in the decoration of Indian daggers. I tried to remedy this state of affairs by including such weapons in exhibitions that don't typically display arms and armor, in order to draw attention to the artistry and craftsmanship that went into making them, and that undeniably classifies them as art objects. I chose to start the lecture with this detail from a dagger scabbard, as I find it illustrates both the Indian gem setting Condom Technique and the Indian fascination with color, which is manifest in their use of brightly colored gems. One small detail which is quite interesting is this eye of the birds, which are emerald cabochons, and they are probably less than a millimeter in diameter. What's more, as the Indian fascination with color, compounded with a great appreciation of naturalia, it should come as no surprise that it proved inspirational in the ornamentation of their weapons, a decorative approach which one would generally not expect to find on weapons. This here illustrates the little piece that I showed you, the detail which I just showed you in relation to the dagger scabbard, and should give you an idea of the skill and artistry that went into producing it. Now, back to that. This type of work could only be achieved by setting the gemstones in the Condom Technique, a technique that is unique to India and allowed craftsmen nearly limitless artistic freedom. The technique involves hyperpurifying strips of gold by repeatedly heating them to the point at which the metal becomes soft and malleable at room temperature. At this degree of purity, once the gold is applied to a surface and piled up to achieve the required thickness, it forms a molecular bond that turns the strips into a mass. The jeweler is then able to set gems on a surface by packing gold around them to hold them in place and dispense with setting stones in protruding collets or holding them in place with claws. By virtue of this technique, which could be applied to any rigid surface, jewelers were able to set stones close together and, once the gold hardened, to engrave the surface surrounding the stones, which I think you can see. All the surfaces around the stones are engraved. This is another set of, they're dagger sidebars, and I'll show you the dagger in a minute so you can tell how small the surface is that is worked on. And you can see here they're like fleur-de-lis decoration, and here they differ. Here they're like half palmettes that are engraved, detailed, and I mean, there are things that look like claws, but they're not really claws that hold the stones. And this is the blade guard, which again has a different decoration, which you can see up there. And this is the dagger to show you the detail and how small the surface was that was worked on. This is an interesting, they're sidebars of another Qatar. One could say that here you have, overlapping diamond flowers here. And they share one petal, so they overlap. That's the exterior. So it's a bit baroque and exuberant, whereas the interior sidebars are more structured and geometric, because the halved diamonds on the sides that are halved by the edge of the bar imply continuity ad infinitum. It's like implies a geometric pattern. And this is the scale of what I've just shown you. This is also interesting. This is a different type of dagger. And one of the interesting aspects of this is at the lower end of the hilt, where it's wider, the cells that hold the emeralds are octagonal, whereas when it tapers, they become hexagonal. This is also to show you that they use the same technique to inlay hard stones. This is a Jade Hilt, and it's inlaid with gold, of course, with rubies and emeralds. And this is very beautiful. This is black, almost black jade, and it's inlaid with white jade and rubies, and the white jade is the petals and the leaves are fluted. There's also, they applied kundan with enamel. This is a beautiful Qatar, and you could see the inclusion of insects and those are Chinese cloud bands. They're auspicious cloud bands for protection and luck and this is harness fittings, either for a horse or an elephant. And the base, the red, is enamel, and it's of the best quality enamel. And the flowers are set with diamonds and emeralds. And I could not resist but to show you this. The detail of the floral spray, this one, that the base of the stem is a bird's head. And this, you know that it was undoubtedly done at the craftsman's discretion. This is an archery ring, and the exterior is enameled and set with turquoise and rubies. Turquoise were not easy to come about. They got them from Iran, and the interior is in the same design but enameled. And when you think of the sophistication, because the interior of the enamel of the ring would never have been seen by anyone but the owner, but it is beautifully enameled. And another way of enhancing decoration of objects was through the variety of gemstone cuts. One of the distinct types consisted in setting natural diamond crystals or uncut and unpolished diamonds left in their natural cube octahedral. This is a diamond that has not been cut or polished. It is in its natural crystal form. And they were used to line the outline of the pommel bar and the lower end, and the sides of the knuckle guard, and the sides of the guard. I daren't say that it was to protect the object because the diamond is such a hard stone, but it could possibly be the case. Here you have a bottle, probably a scent bottle, and it's outlined with diamond crystals. And it has been said a lot. It's worth mentioning here, even though I'm sure everybody already knows it, that the diamond mines of the Deccan in India were the only sources of diamonds in the world until the end of the 18th century. And one can judge from that subtle graduation of the crystals outlining the hilt and the bottle, the large amount of diamond crystal available to jewelers that allowed them to achieve the desired graduated effect. Although the prevailing view is that diamond crystals set in their natural state only occurred in around the 17th century, an ancient ring in the collection demonstrates that natural diamond crystals were used in the area since antiquity. This is part of a diamond crystal, and it's unpolished and uncut. Among Indian gem setting techniques, later replicated or adapted to produce a similar effect by renowned European jewelers, was Talib Setting, a technique whereby gemstones are packed tightly side by side and held in place by the outlining gold, allowing jewelers to create the effect of an uninterrupted field of color. In Europe, the technique was referred to as sertie invisible or mystérieux, as gems were set in grooves or rails that were invisible on the surface. But I must say that the end result was quite different. Another technique was channel setting, or a technique which served to produce uninterrupted lines of colors in which abutted stones are set in a line held only by a groove or channel in the outlining gold borders, which was referred to in the West as sertie en rail. You see, all these, there's no gold in between the stones or here either. And see how it curls out. Oops. Here you have channel setting on the upper end of the hilt and around the disc pommel and in the grip bars of this dagger. This is all channel set. India is also as celebrated for its decorative styles of enameling executed with a finesse usually encountered in miniature painting from the period. This is especially worthy of admiration because, unlike its long-standing tradition of gem cutting and gem setting, no form of enamel work existed in the area, except for a few examples of cloisonné enamel dating from the Greco-Bactrian period, which is from the middle of the 3rd century BC, the 3rd century BC to the first quarter of the 2nd century AD. And this is cloisonné enamel that, I mean, it is quite deteriorated because it's a very ancient object. Enameling was introduced to Indian courts by European jewelers in the later 16th and early 17th centuries. And as it provided Indian jewelers with a new means to stimulate their creativity, they immediately excelled in the art. I have to add here that it has been said, without supporting evidence, that the art of enameling was introduced to India by enamelers from Lahore and the Punjab, who migrated to Amer and Jaipur. It's likely that this misleading assumption arose from 19th century accounts written about the subject when Maharaja Sawai Ram Singh II founded his famous School of Arts and Crafts in Jaipur, which became an important enameling center. Here you can see the bastai work under the buds that give it relief. I mean, it exists under leaves as well, but under these it's very obvious. This is a ragini, and she used to play the veena, which is here. It's a musical instrument, and she was always accompanied by male and female deer and male and female rabbits, and this is the back of the ring that is set with a spinel. And these are overpainted enamels for the detail. This is quite an extraordinary object. It is a sword, and this is the head of a makara, and these are makaras. But on one side of the scabbard, it's treated like Persian miniatures. You have birds and buildings, and they are separated by colored rocks, which was a treatment very much used in Persian miniatures of the late Timurid period and the Safavid period. On the other side of the same object, you have scrolls that are very much in the ancient classical style. And you have bracts with scrolls coming out and flowers. And the colors of the enamels are beautiful. Most of the enameling techniques, I'm sorry, I forgot to say them there. Chanlevie consisted of filling an excavated surface with enamel powder that is then fired and fused in place. Bastai, which involves engraving the metal surface with the motif and covering it with transparent enamel, allowing the relief decoration to be seen through the enamel. And there was ronde bosse, a technique that was developed in the West in around the 14th century, which consisted of enameling objects in the round. In addition, India's distinguished achievements in sculptural arts and carving furnished a considerable amount of exquisitely carved precious and hard stone nails in non-representational as well as vegetal and animal forms that testify to this tradition. I mean, this is clearly, it's an emerald hilt. Unfortunately, the blade does not belong. It would have had a double-edged blade that, whoops, that would have extended from the edges of the hilt. And on the underside of the hilt, you can see that it's cut to accommodate a double-edged blade. This is a small sapphire hilt. It's very beautiful. And the hole that's pierced through is painted blue so that it doesn't disturb the eye when, and another distinctly Indian edged weapon is the type with floral pommel, a feature that does not exist anywhere else and furthermore corresponds with decorative practices prevalent on a large number of Indian weapons. This is a particularly beautiful object. Each petal of the bud is sort of slightly overturned around the edge. The bud seems to be sitting on the tips of the leaves. The leaves are very beautifully carved. Even the tip of the edge of the leaf is overturned. This one curls under the bud. I mean, there is, of course, I'm sure that the patrons asked for certain things, but there is both. There is the patrons and the craftsmen. You cannot produce such a thing just by asking for it, ordering it. And this is another beauty, where you have the flower, the calyx of the flower is cut in the round, and the stem, and the craftsman obviously picked the darker part in the jade to use to be the flower, and then it becomes whiter and whiter. Then you have animal head pommels. This is jade and set with ruby eyes. And this one is a tiny horse hilt. And the interesting thing about this is because you had to insert the blade tank, so it's the tip of the blade. If they hadn't done this, the tip of the blade would have shone through the rock crystal, and which wouldn't have been appropriate. So all the rock crystal hilts have this extension to them. Of course, you don't see it when it's covered with a ferrule and all that. And this is another extraordinary hilt carved from white jade. The material is very precious because you don't always find very purely white jade. Then, just as important with regards to decorative techniques are the methods of inlaying and overlaying metal with gold and silver. The process of inlaying involved engraving a pattern in the surface and inlaying it with precious metal. It was practiced by the Egyptians and the Mycenaeans since the 2nd millennium BC and only spread to other parts of the world around the 4th century BC. This archery ring is engraved in the name of Shah Jahan. There are a few archery rings in the name of Emperor Jahangir, and a few in the name of Emperor Shah Jahan. But the funny thing is they always had their names on the underside of the ring, never on the exterior. And on the exterior here you have the 99 names of God. This is a sword hilt, and it's pretty because you can see that the decoration that is on the hilt extends under the hilt. And this sort of this sleeve, that petal that crosses the flower, and this is the upper end of the hilt. And these, if you can notice, the irises get bigger and bigger towards the top. And the craftsman never would represent an iris and not use the right leaf form. By contrast, the process of overlaying metal with gold, which appears to have emerged in China during the Western Han period, which is the 3rd century BC to the first quarter of the 1st century AD, involved cross-hatching the metal surface to allow the adhesion of coats of gold or silver, which were subsequently outlined according to the intended design and burnished onto the surface. So here, I don't know if you can see the cross-hatching. Yes, here. You can still see it, and in certain places. That was under the gold. And on this cutter also, and you could pile up as much as you wanted the gold. Well, now, okay. Last but not least, Indian wood steel, from which the marvelous examples of pattern-welded or jawhar blades were produced, was of long-standing repute, and is reported that when Alexander the Great invaded India in 327 BC, he returned with a large amount of wood steel, which he ordered forged into weapons. What's more, since antiquity, the Near East imported Indian wood steel to manufacture fine blades. But despite that, in most places, pattern-welded steel is still referred to as Damascus steel. Damascus' long-standing and misleading reputation for superior blades was largely due to the famous arms and shield fabrique founded in Damascus by the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from the middle of the 3rd to the 1st quarter of the 4th century AD, which used Indian wood steel to manufacture weapons. It's important to note that the composition and treatment of woods steel that produced the jawhar patterns was achieved prior to the steel they called cakes of steel leaving India, thus before the blades were manufactured. Now I'll give you a short aperçu on the origins of some Indian weapons and how they evolved. Before I start, I must say that one can rarely rely on written sources to determine the period in which most weapons were produced, because even when they were assigned familiar, and by that I don't mean generic names, their forms were never described. For example, when the armor housed in the Khan-e-Dawlat, House of Dominion, is described by Princess Gulbadan, the sister of Emperor Humayun, the daughter of Emperor Babur, during a feast commemorating the accession of the Mughal Emperor Humayun to the throne, daggers are referred to as khanjar, Arabic for dagger, and jamdar, one of the Indian names given to the Qatar, and swords as shamshir, the Persian for sword, only singling out weapons that were jeweled with no description of the weapon, its decoration, or detailing of the gems. They would just say it's murassa. I will start with the Chelanum, which can probably claim the oldest lineage, evolving almost directly from the 2nd millennium BC forged copper antenna hilts that were reportedly found in Fatehgarh, Uttar Pradesh. Although there is evidence of the type from archaeological sites spanning a wide geographical range, it only seems to have retained its basic structure in India. Those 3 antenna swords are in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And they were forged, the blade was forged and the hilt all in one. With time, simple linear bars evolved. And you've seen our jeweled chelanum. They're slanting downwards and curled bars like this one, with a knob in the center. Another example deriving from the distant past is and this is what I gave my lecture about 2 years ago, is the dagger with the cloven pommel, which originated in northwest Iran in this condition. It originated earlier from natural bones, but this is the bronze representation of it during the 1st millennium BC in Luristan, and resurfaced with a slightly modified form at the Mughal court during the 1st quarter of the 17th century, like this. And the type generally referred to as ear daggers journeyed to the west through Europe in the period preceding and during the early centuries of the Common Era and retained the same form until the Renaissance period. The Emperor Boabdil, Sultan Boabdil, had a dagger, an ear dagger as well, in the 14th century. Oops. During the Renaissance, the ear dagger was considered to be an Italian or Spanish invention. So it's no coincidence that the maker of one of the finest examples was a Spanish swordsmith by the name of Diego de Sayas, who was active around the middle of the 16th century. Not much is known about him, except that at one point he was in the service of King Henry II of France, for whom he produced maces which included scenes clearly tied to Indian iconography that also had inscriptions in Pseudo-Kufic. Here you can see the inscription up there and an inscription here. But, I mean, I've tried to read them. The inscriptions don't read. And this ear dagger illustrated, furthermore, the blade in the Hamzanama from 1562 to 77, and a manuscript commissioned by Emperor Akbar, enforces a European connection with the with our ear dagger. I mean, they, and I've asked the curator of the Metropolitan, the Arms and Armor, and he said this is definitely a Renaissance blade. They were called cinque dea because they were supposed to be the equivalent of 5 fingers in breadth. And the upper end is really very much like the Renaissance daggers. Actually, the cinque dea blades go back to the Etruscan period. And this is the Renaissance dagger of Diego de Sayas, which he signed in Latin here with his name. What is quite interesting in that is that the pommel structure of a first millennium BC weapon from northwest Iran journeyed through time and over distances and served as inspiration for 16th century Spanish swordsmith, which in turn presumably inspired the weapon makers of the Mughal court when they developed their hilts with cloven pommel. Shapes of weapon hilts never really changed very much, and of course because of battles and wars, there was a great exchange of shapes. But evidently, as you needed a weapon to be comfortable and to be useful, you could not fantasize a lot about their shapes. On the other hand, strange as it may seem, there don't seem to be any archaeological finds of the quintessentially Indian Qatar, which has furthermore been dubbed Kotara, Jamdar, Yamadar, and variants thereof, in early and later accounts, but without ever being described. Fortunately, an unexpected indicator came about via the Ardhashastra, a treatise on governance, presumably compiled between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD, in which the author associates the Kutara and the Pata, but only describes them as sharp weapons. Structurally, the Pata is a sword fitted with a gauntlet and with the same side bars and transverse grip bars as the Qatar, which probably explains why, in the mid-14th century, Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveler, when visiting Gwalior, referred to a Katara in the accounts of his travels, but describes a Pata. Since both weapons are structurally closely related, it seems likely that Ibn Battuta confused the terms. But the name and descriptions he gives of the weapon are sufficient evidence of the type's existence during the 14th century. having to rely on visual representations to determine more or less when the Qatar became a weapon of choice, I found what I think may be the earliest existing depiction of a Qatar in a 1475 to 1500 manuscript of the Kalpa Sutra attributed to Gujarat or Rajasthan. And you can see the Qatar as it is. In this painting, the Qatar is depicted in exactly the same form as we know it today, which supports the idea that by then its form was already perfected and adopted. Towards the middle of the 16th century, it steadily gained in popularity, both in the south and in the areas under Mughal rule, and was a great favorite of the Emperor Akbar. Also in favor during the 17th century were weapons with forms that derived in a general sense from the East, such as weapons with animal head pommels, that are associated with nomadic tribes from the eastern Eurasian steppes since around the 2nd millennium BC. This is a dagger in the collection, and these tribes interacted a great deal among themselves through herding, raiding, and warfare, factors which led to great uniformity in their art and culture. This level of interaction was instrumental in spreading, among other things, animal-headed weapons. The type endured for a fairly long period, but died out towards the end of the 1st millennium BC. However, a naturalistic version emerged during the Mughal period, most likely inspired by the rulers' interest in the art and customs of their Central Asian ancestors. Finally, the bird head pommel, or as some call it, the pistol grip, which existed since pharaonic times, when daggers with falcon head pommels, representing Horus, the god of war, were exclusively worn by kings. The trend endured almost uninterruptedly through Greek and Roman times and prevailed until the Sasanian period, from the 3rd to the 7th century CE, Common Era. Thereafter, representations are few and far between, but after the turn of the 17th century, they start to feature more and more frequently in the repertoire of Indian weapons. And finally, in answer to the frequently asked question about whether these weapons were ceremonial, all I can say is that it is clear from the signs of wear on some of the blades, as well as signs of blade replacement on account of breakage, which is visible on the underside of blade guards, that they were functional and not just a means of adornment, reflecting the social status of their owner. In conclusion, only the exceptional refinement and elegance of Indian courts, coupled with connoisseurship of the jeweled arts and appreciation of superb craftsmanship, could have produced the marvelous objects that I had the pleasure of presenting during this lecture.